Activity 35, histology for the urinary and reproductive systems. And we're starting here with the kidney. And in the kidney, we're seeing two areas. We're seeing the superficial renal cortex with its associated structures and the deeper renal medulla region. So we're starting with the superficial cortex. So we're here outside of the organ. And we'll begin with the details of the cortex. So again, here's completely outside of the organ. So all of this whole image is from the cortex, that superficial cortex. And a trait of the cortex is now the appearance of the renal corpuscles. So we can see those highlighted here. That entire area of a renal corpuscle, only located in the cortex. And looking at the corpuscle specifically now, we're able to see the detail of the parietal epithelium lining just around the white space. So right where I'm drawing here would be that parietal epithelium, just bordering the white space. And we could zoom in. So again, on the cortex, we know because we're able to see a renal corpuscle. And then just that very thin layer is the parietal epithelium, capsular epithelium, or Bowman's capsule. And now surrounding it, we see all these other tubes here, all these other rings. And we don't have to be specific, as the lab manual says. These are just some type of convoluted tubule. So either proximal or distal, and we don't have to differentiate between them. So whereas the cortex has the defining trait of renal corpuscles, when we move deeper into the medulla, and that's the area here, the medulla lacks any renal corpuscles. And in fact, in the medulla, we just see a bunch of rings. So this is just a cross section through different portions of the nephron. And some of them are with a thicker wall of tissue. Some of them have just a thin wall of tissue. And we don't have to differentiate between the different types. So here's what I mean by the thin wall or the thicker wall, but we don't have to differentiate between loops of Henle versus collecting ducts. But you notice in the medulla lacking any renal corpuscles. So the next sample is now the urinary bladder. And within the urinary bladder, the first trait we'll point out is the big folds of tissue. So these are the rugae. So just the large folds of tissue. And now starting at the mucosa, the superficial layer, that's the name of their layer, is the mucosa. But taking a look at the actual tissue, the cells, we have transitional epithelium that's in the layer called the tunica mucosa, or just simply mucosa. So now deep to that is where we get to the area of the submucosa. So right in here, and extends into the ruga as well. And then the rest of this area here, we have this very thick triple layer of smooth muscle. And this is all the detrusor muscle. Now we could take a closer look. So in the layer known as the mucosa, and you can see the cell types, the tissue, the transitional epithelium, in the layer as the mucosa. Deep to that, we have the area of the submucosa. And then the rest of this view here, we're seeing a section through the detrusor muscle. So now moving on to the reproductive system, the male reproductive system specifically. This is the histology of the testis. So we could start here with the term the collagenous sheath. Collagenous sheath, one name for that, or the tunica albuginea. So at the surface of the testis. And now we notice inside of the testes, we see these rings. So any of these open rings are seminiferous tubules. So that entire ring there, seminiferous tubule. And the spermatocytes, that's referring specifically to the sperm cells. And we can see those as the staining of the nuclei, essentially little dots. And the sperm cells develop in the wall of the seminiferous tubule. And they also move inwards towards the lumen. So truly just the nucleus represented here. That would be the nucleus of a spermatocyte in some stage of development. Whereas now interstitial cells are found surrounding the seminiferous tubules. And we're just looking for these little enclosed clusters of cells. And these are known as interstitial cells or Leydig cells. And we'll have a closer look. So here's now a closer look on a cluster of interstitial cells, where we see the enclosed cluster, whereas the open ring, this is the seminiferous tubule, and we can see the developing sperm cells represented by the nuclei of the cell. They're in the wall, and sperm cells also move into the lumen of the seminiferous tubules. So now a separate organ that's on this side here, we're in the area of the testis. And again, we see those familiar open rings, the seminiferous tubules, the enclosed clusters of interstitial cells. Once we cross the collagenous sheath, and it's now onto this view, on this side of the image is where we have the epididymis. So this portion here. So organ right along the testis, but outside of that collagenous sheath. And then moving on to the female reproductive system, there's the ovary. So starting near the surface, not the absolute surface, but near the surface, and we'll zoom in to see the area of the tunica albuginea. The ovarian cortex, and once again, the cortex is the superficial portion. And in this case, the cortex is the area that contains all of the follicles. So I'm roughly kind of highlighting here. The superficial area that contains the follicles, and here's an example of a follicle, are found in the cortex. And the area that lacks follicles, this is the medulla of the ovary. The ovarian cortex versus ovarian medulla, lacking any follicles. So starting out with the cortex, we want to look very close to the surface. And again, that's where we find the area of the tunica albuginea. It's not the absolute surface, but very close to the surface. And now, just deep to that layer is where we find the multiple, they're called primordial follicles, just these small little areas right here that I'm circling. There's multiple, very close to the tunica albuginea, multiple primordial follicles. Whereas skipping over, these primordial follicles do develop with the ovarian cycle and over time. Now here's an example, skipping many steps over to a tertiary or mature or Graafian follicle. Multiple names for the same thing here. And it's within the mature follicle especially, we could get a good look at the oocyte. So that egg that's still undergoing some maturation process. The entire structure is the mature follicle, and within we see the oocyte. And here is a closer look at a primordial follicle. And you can see that there are several of these, and also the tunica ablugenia that we see here very close to the surface, covered by this very, very thin layer of epithelium.